what will be Australia's commitment, perhaps at all, or to also read what should be Australia's commitment, because surely Australia will be involved with this, even though we're talking primarily about the American partnership. And we're extremely fortunate, I think, to have a great panel and a wonderful moderator, if that's the right term to use. And that, of course, is Mr. Hamish McDonald here on my right, who currently is the Asia Pacific editor for the Sydney Morning Herald. But of course, Hamish has had a very distinguished journalistic career with a focus on the Asia Pacific, and he also has a very close connection with this organisation because he is a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. On his right, we have Dr. Adam Lockyer, who is a lecturer in American politics and foreign policy in the United States Studies Centre at University of Sydney. And on his right, Anthony Bubelow from the Lowy Institute. Anthony is the West Asia Program Director at Lowy, and we welcome him as well. And on my far right, Mr. Nakib Nouri. Mr. Nouri is living here in Sydney, but was a senior diplomat in the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Kabul. So I think all three of our panellists are eminently qualified to talk on this topic. And as I say, we have in Hamish a person with vast experience, journalistic and otherwise, in the area. So Hamish, I'll hand it over to you. Hamish will conduct the proceedings, and I won't come back for the very end.
I'm not sure I like the very Presbyterian title of moderator. A sort of stirrer, and I hope we can get a very lively discussion here today. We have three speakers from very interesting backgrounds, and we're gathering at a time of beginning of a great transition. A few days ago, President Barack Obama was in Kabul and signed the Strategic Partnership Agreement with President Hamid Karzai to set out in very broad and I must say rather unspecific terms the support that America and its allies will give to the Afghan government and its various arms from 2014 for 10 years. Later this month, in about 2 weeks' time, the various supporters of the Karzai government will gather in Germany and talk about their contributions to that 10-year program. This will include Australia, and we will certainly be expected to pay out our share of the annual funding that will flow to Kabul after the major part of the foreign military forces wound down in 2014. It will be a very interesting transition. I'm sure some of the speakers will hark back to other periods of transition, such as the 1989, 1992 period when the Soviets had withdrawn and left the government that they had fostered under President Najibullah to continue. That ended really only when the Soviet Union collapsed itself. Then we had the transition under a Mujahideen government, which in turn came from the Islamist Taliban and other militias supported by Pakistan. These provide perhaps some clues to what might happen, but of course the mix is quite different. I expect our speakers will look at the imperatives driving each side, the dilemmas of whether, how to pull out, and whether even a partial US presence is still going to be a fatal political drawback for the Kabul government, how it will affect relations with Pakistan, how it's viewed by China and the other surrounding powers, and how, from the Afghan perspective, how the forces of modernization and nationalism can deal with the centrifugal forces of ethnic loyalties, language, and degrees of religion that are so much in play.
So very early on in his administration, this date of 2014 started to float around. There was two reasons for this. The first one was that he needed to send to the electorate, his own population, that the United States wasn't going to be in Afghanistan forever. He needed to send the message that this was not going to be another Vietnam, that there was a time limit, and that at some point in the future, the United States was going to get out no matter what the conditions were going to be. The second reason was to send a message to Kabul, and to send the message that the current state of the governments in the country couldn't go on. That at some point in the very near future, Kabul was going to have to stand on its own 2 feet. And so this figure of 2014 started to be floated around. The Obama administration came under a quite significant attack from their political opponents by putting a time limit on the commitment to Afghanistan. That some of the political opponents within the United States said that you shouldn't be highlighting or telling your enemies in Afghanistan when you were going to be withdrawing. But on balance, Obama decided that, one, he needed to tell his own population the limits of their commitment, and two, he needed to make sure that Kabul was fully aware that from 2014 they were going to have to take responsibility for their own security and their own governance of the country. Over the course of the Obama administration, there has been quite a bit of friction between Obama and Hamid Karzai. Hamid Karzai has said on numerous occasions that he feels as though his voice isn't being heard, and the recent visit of Obama to Afghanistan was in large part to quell these fears that Hamid Karzai, his voice is being heard, and that the United States is taking seriously the concerns of the Afghan government. So then we can turn to what the objectives of the United States are in Afghanistan currently. The first one is terrorism, harking back to that old chestnut. The United States doesn't want Afghanistan and that region to become a haven for international terrorism again. And they're going to, whatever policies that we see in the future are going to make terrorism and counter-terrorism as the centre of their attention. So in the near future, we're going to see this transition from counter-insurgency to a great emphasis on counter-terrorism. And that you'll see that this language will be used more in the future. But the United States also doesn't want a failed state in Afghanistan. The big fear here is that a failed state in Afghanistan will spill over to Pakistan. And that's a huge concern in Washington at the moment. And Pakistan is much larger and much more significant regionally than Afghanistan, and this could possibly also lead to loose nukes, which is a major concern for Washington. So a fragile, unstable, failed state in Afghanistan may contaminate Pakistan, destabilise Pakistan, and this is a major concern within Washington. The third major objective of the United States is that a stable Afghanistan, a secure Afghanistan, will be much better for Pakistan-India relations than an unstable Afghanistan which is ruled by the Taliban. So those three different concerns are front and centre within the United States' mind at the moment. Counterterrorism, loose nukes, and within Pakistan, and the contagion of Afghanistan into Pakistan, and the relationship between Pakistan and India. So what are the objectives, the limitations of the United States on achieving these three objectives? The first is money. Money is increasingly tight, not only in the United States, but also right across Europe. So within the NATO alliance, the amount of money that each state is willing to commit to Afghanistan in the future is going to be finite. This is not an open-ended promise. And so we're going to see next week there's going to be a major NATO conference in Chicago, and the major concern of that conference will be who's picking up the tab. So the figure that I've seen for the amount going into the future is they're looking for about $6.2 billion to fund the Afghan military security forces, and what is going to be the division of that between the United States on the one hand and the Europeans. The Americans are pushing hard for a 50-50 split, so about $3 billion each, whereas the Europeans prefer the figure of $2 billion for the Europeans and $4 billion for the United States. And that's the major concern, and that's why both Hillary Clinton and Petraeus both went off to Brussels last month. They're the things that they're arguing about. The major other limitation is troops. One of the big things that the Obama administration likes to harp on about is that it was able to extract its troops from Iraq, and it is on the process of extracting its troops from Afghanistan. I think that if Obama can retire and he can point to these two major achievements of being able to extract his troops and bring them home, he'll be happy with that legacy. He'll be able to point to his legacy and say he was the president of peace and be able to bring his troops home. So we have those two major limitations. One, money, and two, that the troop commitment is not going to be sustainable into the long-term future. So in the short term, there are going to be two major dilemmas in the challenges in the US-Afghan relationship. The first one is from 2014, the status of forces, the status of the US forces in Afghanistan. And this is why the recent commitment of Obama to Afghanistan was so vague, because that hasn't been resolved yet. And this was the big stumbling block for continued American forces in Iraq. The big concern is limb. So if a US soldier commits a crime within Afghanistan, whose law does he fall under, or she fall under? And this status of forces was the reason why all the US troops were pulled out, or most of the US troops were pulled out of Iraq. Yeah? And so what the Afghans want is that if a US soldier was to run the rails, commit a crime, that they fall under Afghan law. That this is a major concern for Afghan sovereignty. Whereas the United States will never agree to that. If a soldier commits a crime, they fall under US military law and they're tried by Americans. Yeah. That's one big stumbling block from 2014 onwards. The other is the reliability of both the Afghan government and Afghan security forces. If the Afghan government continues to be, or demonstrate, at least through American eyes, as being corrupt and inefficient, this is going to make Americans far less willing to continue to support the regime, both through economic aid, but also through a military commitment, whether that's training or advisors or what have you. And also the security forces as well. If the Afghan security forces continue to, there is signs that they are improving, but if they're not seen as being reliable partners in the fight against the insurgents and terrorism, this once again will make the United States, both its population and its government, far less willing to continue on giving an open-ended commitment to Afghanistan. So I've sort of ran through what the objectives are of the United States, what the limitations are on fulfilling those objectives, and the two key challenges I see them. The first one, and the big one, will be the status of forces. The second one is the reliability of the Afghan government and the security forces.
Thanks, Hamish. Good evening. I'd like to thank the AIIA for inviting me along this evening. I wanted to kind of focus my comments in the limited time I have on what all this means for Australia and Australian policy towards Afghanistan. And I think to understand Australian policy, one interesting way to look at Australia's involvement in Afghanistan is to see it as Australia's involvement as being in the form of fighting two wars in Afghanistan. In a sense, our first war, of course, was after the US was attacked on September 11th. We invoked the ANZUS alliance and we went with the US to Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban and to capture or kill as much of Al-Qaeda as was possible. What a lot of people miss, however, is that our involvement in that war ended fairly abruptly. By the end of 2002, most Australian forces in Afghanistan were withdrawn, and there was a single Australian Army officer that was left in Afghanistan to serve in the liaison capacity. So essentially, that was our first war in Afghanistan. And that was what we were doing. We were participating in what was essentially an American punitive expedition in Afghanistan to punish those people that were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Our second war in Afghanistan did not begin until 2005, when a decision was taken by the Australian government that day to send a significant force of Australian soldiers back to Afghanistan. The aim of this war from an Australian perspective, but also reflecting the change that had taken place in the the NATO ISAF's aims in that war were significantly different. This was not a punitive expedition. It was about trying to stabilise the country and widen the remit of the Afghan government in Kabul. So, since 2005, in our commitments to Afghanistan, which have kind of basically gone from around 1,100, have been between 1,100 and 1,500 troops. The commitment has gone through a variety of iterations, including it's done development work, it's done army training. There has been a movement back and forward, not a continuous presence, but a movement back and forward of our special forces continuing to do some of the kind of counter-terrorism work, similar to what they were doing in that first period of our involvement in Afghanistan. But if the nature of Australia's commitment to Afghanistan changed from that first war to that second war, the reasons we went to Afghanistan were broadly the same. The key driving imperative was, of course, our relationship with the United States. That was explicit in that first war. We invoked the ANZUS treaty in response to an attack on our ally. But it was also there in that second commitment. I remember being in government, still being in DFAT at the time, in that interregnum period, and certainly when I left at the end of 2003, there was no expectation that Australian forces would be going back to Afghanistan in significant numbers. So the driving force again there was a request by our ally, I should actually say allies, because I think some of the other allies played a role in this, in helping to essentially spread the remit of the Afghan government beyond the borders of the capital, Kabul. But if Australia's alliance with America was the primary reason for our involvement in Afghanistan, it wasn't the only reason, of course. Terrorism was a valid reason for us being there, and one that governments have continuously referred to in terms of our involvement in that country. It's valid not just in the sense of us participating in an international mission against a threat that was seen to be kind of global in nature, affecting all countries. It had a very specific connection with Australia in that those members of JI who organised the Bali bombings in 2002 represented a part of a movement whose ideas and activism had been very specifically radicalized by their experience in Afghanistan. In other words, whilst members of a radical movement, they had developed a sense of having a very specific mission that was directed outward against foreigners and not just turning Indonesia into an Islamic State. And that experience, that formative experience, is very specifically linked to Afghanistan and very specifically linked to the connections that key members of JI had with Al-Qaeda. So it wasn't just a general sense that we were fighting terrorism globally, but a very specific link to Afghanistan that directly affected the lives of Australians in 2002 in Bali. So if we look at the situation today, and the Prime Minister recently announced that we will begin the withdrawal of our forces next year. How do these factors play into what will be Australia's policy in Afghanistan over the next few years? In the same way that the US alliance defined our entry into Afghanistan, it will also define our exit. It's fairly clear that Australia's withdrawal from Afghanistan has been and is dependent on our ability to convince the US that we have done our part. And I think there's no question in my own mind that in announcing the beginning of Australia's withdrawal from Afghanistan next year, that the Australian government has convinced essentially the US of that. And one of the reasons they've been able to convince the US of that are the reasons that Adam mentioned earlier in this presentation, because the US has also become convinced that to stay in Afghanistan militarily, at least in the current form, does no one any good. That's not to say, however, that our involvement in Afghanistan is likely to end. As the Prime Minister said, we'll continue to play a significant development role in Afghanistan. Many people are unaware of the fact that Afghanistan today is our fourth largest aid recipient globally, which is significant for a country that basically sits outside our immediate region. The Prime Minister also hinted that whilst the bulk of our military forces would come out of Afghanistan, a small, the possibility that our special forces contingent would remain in the country in some shape or form. This continuing commitment, however, raises more questions than it answers. And it raises questions because if we're looking at Australia's development program in Afghanistan, and we're looking at, as I mentioned, this very significant sum of money being spent in the country, the question is whether we can continue to spend that kind of money, certainly in the way we're spending at the moment, which is very much on the ground in Oruzgan, the province we're essentially responsible for, once our troops withdraw. Much of our aid activity currently is premised on the security provided by Australian forces on the ground, whether that's through the direct activities of our aid officials and diplomatic officials on the ground in Oruzgan, or indirectly through the NGOs that we support in Oruzgan. So once Australian troops pull out, the question is, what will we then start to spend our aid on? There's a second question here, and it relates to the possible role of our special forces. There is no question in my own mind that the US has now switched from a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan that it basically, and for good reason in my view, had very little faith in from the beginning, to a counter-terrorism strategy. In other words, to leave a small number of special forces in the country to continue to deal with terrorist threats both there and in Pakistan as they might arise. The killing of Osama bin Laden last year in Pakistan essentially provides the model for the kinds of activities we'll continue to see in Afghanistan. And it seems, in the fact that the Prime Minister hinted that our special forces may stay, suggests to me that Australian special forces, or a small contingent thereof, will participate in that American counter-terrorism effort in Afghanistan. But there is a question here about sustainability. And that is, how long will Afghans, whether they are currently opponents of the US presence or supporters of that presence, continue to allow their country to be essentially a base for special forces operations both within their country and in their neighbouring country. There's also another question about what we're not doing in Afghanistan. Australia once had a fairly proud diplomatic record as to use that awful phrase, a medium power, where we engage ourselves diplomatically around the world. We offered our diplomatic skills in the pursuit of diplomatic solutions in countries such as Cambodia, in South Africa, and elsewhere around the world. A lot's been said, including by my own institute, about the loss of Australia's diplomatic capacity. But you have to wonder about what we're not doing diplomatically also to support our exit from the region. And here, what I'm talking about, and I'll end on this, is for me the one missing piece of the Afghanistan puzzle, at least in terms of Western disengagement. It may or may not be sustainable for the bulk of Western forces to leave Afghanistan. It may or may not be sustainable to only leave a small special forces element to continue the counter-terrorism fight in that country. But what, in my view, is not sustainable is the idea that we'll simply pull out and allow Afghanistan to again fall prey to its neighbours as it has historically. That will again allow Afghan sovereignty to be largely decided by its neighbours, who will continue, who once again, as they are already, but will do it in a more intense way, play out their own rivalries and conflicts within Afghanistan's borders. That was, in many ways, the source of the problems that emanated out of Afghanistan for us, and may well again become that same source in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Now our final speaker is Mr. Nakib Nouri, and I think I'll just tell you a little bit more about him, because I sense that he will probably not like to talk about himself very much, as he strikes me as a very modest man. Nakib comes from the northern province of Kunduz, which has a very mixed ethnic population, Pushtun, Tajik. Nakib is Tajik, but there are Uzbeks and Turkmen and many others populations from the great mix of Afghanistan. So he's got from childhood an experience of living alongside the many ethnic groups that make up Afghanistan. Secondly, his early career spanned that transition I mentioned in Afghanistan. He won a scholarship and was sent off to Moscow to study law in the 1980s, came back and joined the foreign ministry in 1990, at the time when the year after the Soviet forces had withdrawn, but the Soviet-supported Najibullah government was still in power. 2 years later, that government fell, and the first Mujahideen government was formed. He served with them for 4 years in Kabul, I think, and then became ambassador in Syria. Later in the 1990s, he decided he could not go back to Afghanistan because of the change that had happened then with the rise of the Taliban forces and their capture of Kabul. And he made his way to Australia, where I'm afraid we rewarded him with several years at Villawood Detention Centre, and he's now a resident of Sydney. So he brings a very interesting perspective, and I'm sure can tell us something about the hopes and possibilities of Afghanistan, of its people who want to continue the work of modernising the state that happened over the last century, who also hope to develop an inclusive nationalism among all its ethnic components. So I'd like you to welcome Mr. Nouri.
It's my pleasure to talk about Afghanistan, especially as Mr. Ramesh asked me to talk about the ethnic structure in Afghanistan.
Sorry.
I think that's better.
Yes.
Yeah. In Afghanistan, we have different ethnicity. First is a Pushtun, second Tajik, third Uzbek, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, Charaimok, in another Baluch, in another about 14 ethnicity in Afghanistan. But the main ethnicity in Afghanistan is a Pushtun and Tajik and Hazara. Pushtun is a majority in Afghanistan that they've been in Afghanistan for thousands of years. In the meantime, Tajik and Hazara, especially Hazara, maybe you know about the Buddha's statues. It's about more than 1,500 years ago. It was built in Bamyan province. This, unfortunately, it was destroyed by Taliban, and yeah, it's a very disturbing situation happening in Afghanistan. But what's for me is important to talk what will be happened in Afghanistan when American forces and allies leave Afghanistan. Only one question is for me is very important, that America during 11 years in Afghanistan, together with allies, together with Afghan forces, they couldn't defeat Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In 1 minute, you should think, when America and allies leave Afghanistan, what will be happening? In my opinion, I think if America leave Afghanistan, I think Afghanistan will be victim of the election promises by Obama administration to leave Afghanistan, and withdraw their forces. It will be another human disaster in Afghanistan. Because during this 11 years and plus so-called communist revolution in Afghanistan and also Islamic revolution, our ethnic conflict, ethnic differences is very, very high, very, very high. During these years, thousands of people, even more than 1 million of people were killed in Afghanistan, and thousands, more than thousands, was wounded and invalid, injured in Afghanistan. The conflict between ethnic groups, especially Pushtun, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, Turkmen, is very high. And even in some area, they killed each other. And it's a very big problem in Afghanistan. Another big problem in Afghanistan is Pakistan. We have a historical problem with Pakistan. In 1893, there was, Afghanistan had a huge area, now it belongs to Pakistan, it's Balochistan and Pashtunistan. It belongs to Afghanistan. In 1893, Afghanistan before was under British colony. In 1893, they demarcated as a line is called Durand Line. This line was signed by Durand. He was representative of British in Afghanistan, and also signed on behalf of Afghanistan government. In our government, our people, we don't recognize this line because it was illegitimate lines, and they separated this huge area from Afghanistan and gave to Great India. That time Pakistan was not exist. When in 1947 India got independence, in the meantime, Pakistan also separated from India. And this huge area belongs to Pakistan, and we don't recognize. Because of that, there was, I think, Anthony talked about that stability in Afghanistan is good for Pakistan. I think, in my opinion, Pakistan never want to be in Afghanistan a stable, a strong central government, because they are afraid if in Afghanistan is strong and central government, we will reclaim this huge area from Pakistan. How it will be happen is will be a referendum between this area with Afghanistan, because in this area is living huge population of Pashtuns. In this side in Afghanistan also living a huge population of Pashtuns. If there is happen as referendum, those population will come together with Afghanistan. Then Pakistan is separated. In the meantime, India will also claim referendum in Kashmir, and Kashmir also will separate it from Pakistan. And Pakistan become a political sandwich and very weak government. Because of that, Pakistan never want a strong and central government in Afghanistan. Our majorly during more than 30 years civil war in Afghanistan because of Pakistan, because of ISI in Pakistan, they all the time interfering in our affairs. Because of that, they never want stable, strong, and central government in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
You can't. I mean, and that's not to say that, you know, we should.
The government will.
Well, it's not to say we should kind of, as was the fashion a few years ago, kind of label the conflict kind of AFPAC and try and combine the two, because they're two very different sets of problems. But what I was kind of hinting at the end of my presentation was, what's missing at the moment is some regional effort to decide some rules and processes by which Afghanistan's sovereignty will continue to be respected once US forces leave. And that's what's missing. It's not being, you know, there are some vague attempts to do it diplomatically, and it's obviously hindered by the fact that the US doesn't get along with all of Afghanistan's allies, and there's potentially a role for others to play, including ourselves, if we had that ambition and, dare I say, capacity.
So I don't think it's going to change American policy at all. I think that the US policy towards Afghanistan is now too far down the road, and whether or not Romney wins or Obama wins, I think that the 2014 is now set in stone. The major difference will be the narrative. So if Romney wins, what he will say is that this was what the Obama administration had committed to, and therefore we must follow through. We have no choice. So although I'm a tough Republican and I'm here to win and I like to stay in wars until I win, but I have no choice at this stage. Our NATO allies are going home, and the previous administration had already committed to going home. So therefore, we must just deal with the hand that we're given, and so that's what's going to happen. But I think that the 2014 deadline is going to happen. There'll be a withdrawal of American combat troops at this point, and the American commitment going forward for the next 10 years from 2014 is still an open question. And like I said before, whether or not the American forces stay in significant numbers just to deal with terrorism will mostly hinge upon the status of forces and that agreement, and whatever agreement that the Americans can come up with Kabul.
How long we got? Failure for whom? If you're talking about the US, Afghanistan is really only a failure in terms of the aims it had when it first went to Afghanistan, which was to, as I said, capture or kill those people responsible for the 9/11 attacks, to topple the Afghan government that supported them, and to make sure that Afghanistan was never again used as a base for attacks on US or its allies. I know there's been a lot of talk about what US ambitions for Afghanistan were beyond that, talking in terms of democratization and building an Afghan state. But I think certainly in the minds of successive US administrations, they've actually been fairly clear-sighted when they've talked about democratization and fighting corruption and development in Afghanistan. They've talked about in terms of meeting that first objective, in that if you build a strong Afghan state, then you limit its ability to once again be used as a base for terrorism. If you're talking about Australia, if you accept my argument that largely our involvement in Afghanistan has been defined by a relationship with the US, success or failure is largely defined by whether we've met that alliance obligation. It's a very hard-nosed look at it, but I think that's one, certainly certainly something that the Australian government would position the Australian government, successive Australian governments would take. If you look at failure from an Afghan perspective, then the grounds for failure are much stronger, in that Afghanistan, despite promises from the international community that Afghanistan would be developed, that the international community would help Afghanistan essentially protect its sovereignty into the future, then there has been a failure. And it's been primarily our failure. The Afghans also have to share in that failure, but it's primarily been our failure. This is something we promised to them. Whether we were serious about it or not, whether we were using that simply to serve our other aims, that was what we promised. And therein lies, I think, the real failure in Afghanistan.
I'd like to add my point that there have been several other types of failure. One is that the hopes of the modern, educated Afghans who I met in November, December 2001 are now in a fragile position. And in Herat, for example, there were people who emerged from years of oppression to reopen the writers' community. There were girls who'd been disguising their education as sewing circles. There was a flourishing of the modern Afghanistan, the liberal Afghanistan that had been suppressed by religious extremism, and it would be a tragedy if that was not allowed to continue flourishing, and I fear it might not be. The other big failure alludes to the failure of diplomacy that Anthony talked about. I mean, in that Western area, the influence of Iran is very strong, and in 2001, Iran had a fairly liberal president in its theocratic context, Khatami. It expelled some of the more extreme Afghan elements who were taking refuge there. It was ripe for an intervention because Afghanistan was causing huge problems. Iran had 2 million heroin addicts, for example. There was an opportunity there that the West, including Australia, missed, and we're now in this ridiculous position of trying to punish the Iranians for developing the means to defend themselves against the Bush threat that was the answer they got. I think we could probably still pull some irons out of the fire, but I'm afraid that Obama has been spooked by the forces of conservatism and has lost the capacity to really innovate in that diplomatic way that Anthony suggests. Anyway, that's my 2 lobs worth.
In my opinion, Americans already failed in Afghanistan, I think, because during the 11 years war in Afghanistan, they didn't achieve their objectives together with allies. If I was in Afghanistan, I leave Afghanistan and I take my family from Afghanistan. Why they are leaving Afghanistan? Because of the Taliban pressure on them, they are leaving Afghanistan. Because of their casualties in Afghanistan. I think it will be a big mistake if they are totally, completely leave Afghanistan and leave Afghan people alone without any further strategy in Afghanistan. It will be a human disaster in Afghanistan. Again, will be a field for terrorist activity. Thank you. Karzai's government, when I was working in Afghanistan, Karzai was deputy foreign minister in Afghanistan. I was, how is it? I was head of the political section in the 10th political department last time. Karzai is a good person, but he came to power in the wrong time, I think so. But he's the only symbol of power. The rest of the power in the hand of all warlords, in the hand of allies, coalitions, and American forces. Because of that, in Afghanistan, full of corruption from the A until the Z. There is absolutely no confidence of people. Because of that, I'm saying that the government will collapse if allies and America leave Afghanistan.
What's going to happen in Afghanistan? Well, sort of, if we look at history and see what happened after the Soviet Union left, a lot of people thought that the government would collapse immediately after the Soviet Union left. It didn't. It was able to stagger on for many years after that. And it was able to stagger on for a few years after that because it was receiving significant amounts of Soviet aid, even though the Soviet forces had left. And that aid, that foreign aid, was concentrated in Kabul and then was distributed to the provinces where the local commanders picked sides. You know? And if they selected a side that was allied with Kabul, they were able to receive these fundings and maintain some sort of... So Kabul was able to use this aid as an instrument for controlling some of the provinces. This is not saying that it's going to be peaceful in the provinces. The reason why the commanders wanted this aid from Kabul was because they were, at this point, starting to fight other commanders in the provinces. But you probably see that if there's going to be some sort of stability in Afghanistan moving forward, that international aid has to be flowing through Kabul and it will need to be distributed to the provinces in such a way that the local strongmen receive what they think is a fair share and then answers to Kabul. Right? So it's going to be a balance of power at the micro level. So it's going to be very dicey. It's going to be, it's not, the best you can probably hope for is some sort of stability with aid flying through Kabul. It's not going to be a particularly rosy picture, but from the United States perspective, stability is what they're aiming for moving forward. As I said, the major objectives at this point, the first off is as a counter-terrorism operation moving forward, so it doesn't become a safe haven for international terrorists. And so, as we said earlier, that the operation is slowly shifting from a counterinsurgency to a counterterrorism operation. And the second more is that we don't have a failed state on hands, which is then going to destabilise Pakistan. Yeah, they're the major two objectives. And so it's going to be pretty dicey, but I think that's probably the best the international community can hope for.
Oh, there is not only corruption, but there is also a lot of another things. Instability in Afghanistan, plus corruption, plus insurgency in Afghanistan, and civil war, the meantime. But despite all these 3 or 4 factors in Afghanistan was election, and Hamid Karzai was elected as a president, is a legitimate government. But unfortunately, Americans and allies, they didn't achieve their objectives. That's the main problem. And because of the pressure, now they are leaving Afghanistan. And there is most of the people, they want Americans to stay in Afghanistan. But some people they are following Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they don't want Americans to stay in Afghanistan. Because who want to America stay in Afghanistan, they know that the Hamid Karzai's government will exist because of Americans in Afghanistan. If they are leaving, I think they will collapse. They will collapse in Taliban again, will come to power, and will be a human disaster. And as I mentioned, our problem not with Americans, not with the coalition, our problem with Pakistan. That's our problem. Because in Pakistan, as there says that there is army, Islam, army, and America. Americans mean Americans dollar. Without Islam, without army, without America, Pakistan does not exist. In the meantime, there is in Pakistan. If you are in Pakistan, you will see that you will not feel that there is a government. In the area with the Afghanistan border, there is all tribes area. They are not under control by central government, by Pakistan. They are solving their problem by their tradition. And in the other area next to, in the Kashmir area, close to the Indian border, there is also the same problem. In the Peshawar and Islamabad, there is absolutely, not only Islamabad, Peshawar, Karachi, the whole Pakistan states, absolutely corruption. Worse than Afghanistan, worse than Afghanistan. If you give some money to police in Pakistan, they will implement what you want. I don't know how people live in Pakistan. It's absolutely my imagination. Thank you.